Yeah, okay. I'll stop. Sorry about that.
I didn't even see it sitting there. I'm sorry.
And it's the old batteries too, so it's probably gonna, who knows? So John Rawls was the philosopher that gave us our updated version of the social contract, the legitimating narrative. But since he died in, what was it, 2002, remember we looked at that, Amartya Sen has been kind of Harvard's replacement for political science, economics, and liberalism in a sense. So Amartya Sen is the one who's emphasizing the importance of making sure that everybody's life in the world is as good as possible, and how we might go about doing that economically and politically and so on. So he's the significant individual in Harvard. Martha Nussbaum also works with him and so on. So that's where he is. And he's got quite a few books out and lectures. You can find him on, he's the go-to person in a lot of things. But in this particular lecture, he's talking about David Hume. And that's because it's a John Locke lecture. That doesn't make sense. But actually, it's in Edinburgh. And if we think about David Hume, that's where he was from. It's easy to remember when David Hume dies. He dies in 1776, which I've joked about that year before, right? You know, that it's a great year for Pinot Noir, so it ought to be easy to remember. But what makes David Hume so significant is that he takes the British empiricist point of view to its conclusion, basically. If you look at Hobbes and Locke and Berkeley, who we haven't really talked very much about, Hume is the person that does away with the final grasp at some sort of explanation for order that Berkeley gives it, that it's the mind of God, and Hume points out, how do you know, right? So his critiques against natural religion, arguing that that you can know that God must exist because of inductive reasoning, basically points out that those arguments don't work. And he's an official atheist. I realize there's many different ways of being an atheist. I think there's a book out called The 7 Types of Atheism. Is that right? 7 Types of Atheism by John Gray. This is from October 2018, so relatively new. I'm not sure what all of the 7 types are. I can come up with several myself, of course. A lot of individuals can't officially be atheists because you have to have been a monotheist first. So if you were a member of a society that had a polytheistic set of beliefs and you didn't believe any of those, you don't essentially qualify to be a contemporary atheist, because you have to have at least had the chance to have known what a monotheistic religion would have been like. The argument that there's one God, right? and then not believe that one, right? You know, and so that qualifies you to be a modern atheist. And David Hume is that. He's not a Pastafarian, or he doesn't make fun of that at all. It's kind of odd because even though he was an atheist, he applied for a job at Edinburgh University teaching seminarians, which, of course, the board said, no, that's just dumb. Why would we hire an atheist? I mean, he was a published atheist. Why on earth would you hire an atheist to teach seminarians who, by law, have to believe in God? You know, that's just dumb. So, of course, Hume didn't get the job, and, you know, was kind of upset. That just doesn't make sense, he thought. Well, but he was wrong. What is kind of impressive is that they did eventually hire him as the librarian for the university, for Edinburgh. And that's kind of impressive, and that's actually where he worked most of his career, apart from some other, you know, he did some other things. But as a librarian, that was great for him because he had lots of time to do research, and that's when he published most of his works, thanks to the job that enabled him to sit and basically do the research in the library. And the works that he was most famous for in his own lifetime were his History of England, which became kind of the model for books of that sort. The more famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire was written by, I know the guy's name, I can't think of it. I should look it up. Gibbon. So Gibbon was a young man who was inspired by his David Hume's work on England to do the same sort of work on the Roman Empire.
Look at the publication date, 1776.
Whoa. Well, but there were 4 volumes, I think. So which volume are we talking about here? Oh, they got 1776 through 1789. So, that makes sense. By the way, both of these histories are considered outdated now, because modern historians have lots more resources to go to. So even though they were terrific in their day and very popular, neither of them really are considered the source. You could read them for historical interests, but you really would want to read more contemporary histories than using those as a source today. But even as a young man, I think he was only 18 when he had the startling idea that he then began writing his treatise of human nature. And when he published it, it was absolutely amazing to him that it fell dead-born from the press. Nobody was excited, even though he was. So he thought, you know, it would make him famous and everybody would like him and read the book and rave about the book. And no one did. So that was kind of a shock to him. But one of the individuals that did eventually read the book was Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant he woke from his slumbers, right? So Kant, in reading the book, actually understood David Hume. And so that we end up with now. So that there's famous questions. Does Kant answer Hume? Well, actually, even though there was an overlap in their lives, by the time Kant read David Hume's work, David Hume was already passed, I believe. So that when Kant actually answers David Hume, he's not answering it in a dialogue type of back and forth with Kant, with David Hume, but instead he's taking it on to the next step. So how exactly does David Hume take British empiricism to its logical conclusion? If you remember, stage one with Hobbes, we become aware that all of our perceptions are coming through our senses, and that all of the stuff going into our brain has to come from all of these motions that are coming into our brain. Locke is next, and Locke basically points out, well, that means that we're never actually seeing the things in themselves. We're only seeing things as they appear to us. So there's a dichotomy. This is the empiricist problem, right? The British empiricist problem is that we can't actually know anything about the things in themselves as they are in themselves, right? Only as they appear to us. There's this kind of gap that we can't quite cross, right? Then Berkeley comes along and points out that if Locke convinces people to believe his materialism, that they're going to have to become skeptics, and everybody will start losing belief in God, because God won't have any reason for being part of the picture, right? And by the way, in that sense, Berkeley's, I think, very correct, or predicts the future. Especially, you look at Europe today. There are fewer and fewer people that believe in the traditional religions in Europe. In fact, I think they're at the point where more of the people that do believe in religions are Muslim than Christians in at least northern European countries. England, especially. Notice even in the United States, where it's been slower, there nonetheless does seem to be, especially with the millennials, a movement away from the traditional religions. We're down to like 53% or something people claiming to be religious in the United States in one of the polls, the Rasmussen poll or something. And a lot of that is because of this feeling that, well, nature is on its own. It's evolving, it's material, there's no need for a divine author to direct it, etc. Right? Even the deists, the American deists like Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, believe in a God that created the world but then steps back and doesn't absolutely interact with the world. That's the difference between deism and theism. A theist is someone that believes that there is a God and I can interact with God, whereas a deist believes that God made the world and then that's pretty much it, right? Okay, so Berkeley argues that what unifies the picture we have of the world cannot be matter, but instead has to be the mind of God. Remember, it's kind of like spirit, right? Remember, we have that interesting little video clip from Sophie's World, where Sophie is in that weird little hut talking with Berkeley, and Berkeley is in and out of the mirror and so on. And he's asking her what's real, and he's hitting the table. Is the table real? Are you real? Etc. Of course, it turns out that she's not, actually, right? It's all just spirit in the mind of God, says Berkeley, right? Well, David Hume is the one that comes along and takes that God out of the picture, so that basically you now have the skepticism that this position leads to, that we can't actually know anything about the world as it is in itself, because we're only aware of our perceptions, the way all our ideas are in our mind. It's kind of interesting. The next person that I had in the text was Mary Shepherd. How many of you found her interesting? Mary Shepherd? Lady Mary Shepherd. Pretty darn interesting. She critiques David Hume. She's also from Edinburgh. By the way, I looked up her castle, where she was born. That was fun. You know, in fact, I'm wearing a Scottish tie. I think it's Scottish. Is your
Did
clan?
you do a virtual tour with the classes?
Pardon?
Did you do a virtual tour with the classes?
No, I did not. I did go to Strasbourg today with my glasses, visited some things until I had to put my machine away because my granddaughter's visiting tonight, and we never leave those kinds of machines lying about while she's there, because she could easily knock them over, etc. But I did Google her castle, which is kind of cool. While she was alive, at some point, a wave washed into the dining room of the castle, so that must have been an interesting experience. That's kind of cool. But if you read that, her critique of David Hume was really that his arguments aren't persuasive. That basically she's a follower of Locke, that she's convinced that things persist, and just because, you know, like, I see you there, now you're not there. Oh, you're back. That's pretty dumb, right? That's pretty dumb. So as far as she's concerned, it's much more persuasive to argue that things do persist, even though we're not perceiving them. So if we go back to the question of the tree falling in the forest, she's clearly of the kind of normal American point of view, that of course things persist, even though we cannot prove that they are. Right? But it's much better to actually accept that they are. Of course. Very common sense. Why isn't she more famous than she is? Mary Shepherd. (1777 to 1847).
So she's a contemporary of Wollstonecraft.
Yes.
Interesting.
And the short distance from Edinburgh, from the castle, you can see the city in the distance. So it's pretty interesting. It's on the Firth of Forth. That's kind of fun too. Yeah, so how come she's not more famous? There's a lot of women philosophers that are out there that are not typically treated, especially in intro to philosophy courses. By the way, that's one of the reasons I liked that book, was because it incorporated quite a few other individuals. Okay. Well, let's get back to Kant then, because Kant is next, and Kant is the one who answers David Hume, in a manner of speaking. And how? Now this is significant. Everyone in academia today is a follower of at least Immanuel Kant, if not someone later. So you're at least a Kantian if not later. And so how does Kant solve this problem? He refers to it as transcendental, idealism. And you might, so transcendental, not in the sense that, you know, I'm sure you're all familiar with the joke, the Buddhist monk went to the dentist and to have his teeth fixed, and he refused, what's that stuff they give you to put numb you up?
Novocaine?
Novocaine. He refused Novocaine because the monk wanted to transcend dental medication. Did I get the joke right? I think that's it. He wanted to transcend dental medication. Sorry. But Kant seriously does want to transcend. What does he want to transcend? The limit that we have in the empiricist tradition. And that limit is that we can't know the way things are. And even though we just had a brief section from his critique in the text, the basics are there, that what we essentially have as our answer, thanks to Kant, is that we create, as human beings, our own set of a prioris, or our own and a framework of experience. So from Aristotle on to Kant, metaphysicians are trying to understand the nature of the out there. And with David Hume, we get to the point where we know we're now trapped and we can't know what's out there. We only know what's in here, right? Kant's solution is to turn all of the metaphysics in reverse and point out that what we're not trying to understand is what's out there. What we're trying to understand is how we collectively, as human beings, arrange our experience. So all of the things that Aristotle argued for, the categories, we have a nice list somewhere. Where did it go? We should have a nice list of categories here. Okay, this is them. It's not an, oh, here's a nice list. So remember, they have to have substance. They have to have quantity. They have to have qualification or quality. They have to be relative to something. They have to be in a place, where, when, or time. Being in a position, standing, sitting, lying, doing an action, or having a I skipped having a state, and being affected, or having affection, in other words, affecting others. So all things have to have these categories according to Aristotle. And what we're trying to do is then understand the nature of things and all of the characteristics they have to place them into these various categories. Remember, the encyclopedia then would be basically your description of everything with all of its relevant categories to everything else. And once you knew all of that, you knew everything, because that's all there is to know, all these relationships, right? Well, of course, now we're at the point, thanks to Hume, following, kind of this incremental change, that we now realize, okay, well, because our better understanding of how our knowledge works, we can't actually know the things in themselves at all, so we can't know any of this stuff. Kant takes it and says, well, but no, what we do know, all of these characteristics, these categories, are categories of perception, not the things in themselves. So, for example, time. Everything takes place in time. You can't imagine anything happening unless it happens in time, right? But we now know that time is not a characteristic of the things themselves, but instead is a characteristic of the way we perceive our experience. We're the ones that put everything into its time. Not that time exists out there, but instead that we experience time, and so all of our experiences occur in time, which, you know, psychologically really works well. Kant really stimulates psychology. You know, most psychologies are kind of a response to Kant, because what Kant creates in order for us to transcend this limitation enables us to say, well, so there's some sort of framework inside human beings that imposes these structural elements on our experience. How did that get there? And by the way, how do we explain why some people don't work very well, right? You know, because if you think about it, you know, this Kant is explaining how a rational person perceives experience. Well, but there's a lot of non-rational people out there. What's wrong with them? Aren't they human? Yes. Well, so what's the explanation? Psychology to the rescue. You know, each of them trying to figure out, hey, which explanation might there be for why we've got some people that need explaining, right? You know, but as Kant looks at it, you know, what we have, for example, is something in human beings that experiences everything in time. All along we thought time was something that exists out there and it puzzled us, right? Well, it still puzzles us, but now it's like our framework. We're the ones that walk along with this framework and impose it on our experience. And so time might proceed at a different pace for you know, when we're in a different mood. Douglas.
Yes, so that just boggled my mind there. So how did he come to that premise? Because that can be all over the page for every person. And that can invoke chaos.
I've got a possible answer for this. It's a really good question. But Kant lived in Köln. No, not Köln. Königsberg. And never left. Never, like, apparently 3 miles out of town was about as far as he went. Chances are he was autistic to some extent. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Of course, I mean, this is, you know, way back. Never married, didn't have a family. Had lots of friends, though, and loved to have them over for dinner. He was offered other teaching positions in other universities that were bigger and more important because he was clearly a star, right? And he never wanted to go. He stayed right there. He was really attached to his patterns of life. In fact, there's a great movie.
So he must have been highly functioning autistic then.
That's my guess. Yeah.
To be as social as it sounds like he was, right?
I think so.
Pattern driven, but highly functional in his social endeavors.
Writing's not that easy. But
This is
really
a
can help.
French movie.
This sentence is
I don't know why the
correct,
Germans haven't made a
but it's
movie about
wordy
him.
and hard to read.
Cliche.
And it's old. Sorry. So this is Kant on his daily, he always would go for a daily walk at exactly the same time. In fact, This is before they had very accurate clocks, so the townsfolk would actually reset their clocks by when he walked by their shops.
Are you serious?
That's what they say.
That's hilarious.
And by the way, I don't know if you'll see it or not, but he usually has, yeah, there he is. So even on a nice day, his butler would follow him with the umbrella in case it rained.
You know, straighten his legs.
He really lived pretty old. But you should see how he gets into bed. It's absolutely hilarious.
Should we call him Christopher?
He does everything exactly the same way every.
So he's just OCD.
Well, if you were going to get dressed on TV, you would probably do it this way, I guess.
Well, back then, probably, not today.
Shoes last.
I have a sign by my bed that says, "First pants, then shoes,"
Huh.
so I don't forget, Because
Oh,
if you've
put 'em
ever
on.
put your shoes on, yeah, that's. I couldn't sleep like this.
Oh my gosh.
They didn't have weighted blankets back then. Needed that security.
Monsieur le professeur,
Est-il possible de concevoir un être humain qui jouisse d'une santé plus parfaite que moi?
non, monsieur le professeur. Bonne nuit.
Is he that weird?
So I watched the movie. I thought it was really interesting. I don't know, but there you go. So in answer to your question, I would argue that he was only familiar with the kind of people in his town. They were all pietists, so they all had essentially the same moral point of view. Plus, he had a limited group of friends. So I think, that's a critique of Kant, though, is that a lot of the things he said, people are scratching their heads, like, how could he think all human beings that are, rational think this way? Because, of course, today we would point out that, and Hegel would point out, that you're a person of your time and place, right? The only thing I could say is that, Kant didn't have much familiarity with other times and places. So that would be my reason for thinking he could think that way. But clearly, when we talk about how language affects the way you perceive the world, that language is a significant part of that, right? And if you change the language, you change the soul, change the way you perceive things, etc. We talked about the language, the Worfian hypothesis, remember? Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Language affects reality, affects language.
Right. But so when Kant looks at the categories, he changes it a little bit. He makes it 12 instead of 10. But basically it's the same set of categories that Aristotle has. I mentioned time. You have to experience everything in time. But it's our perception of time that's imposed on our experience. And then By the way, when we talk about Einstein, I think Kant had a big influence on Einstein, because when we look at the space cone, the time space cone, maybe we wanna pick one. Actually, you know what? I want the one with multiple. Maybe. You know it, the one time I'm looking for a specific one, and I guess I didn't inquire the right way.
The 6-cone model?
No, I want the one where all these little cones are floating through the cone. This, I guess this is pretty good. Oh, this is, okay. So this is kind of, so you actually would have, imagine one cone here, but what we have are a bunch of individual cones. They would actually be close, I would think they were closer to one another. We're pretty close. We're within a few feet of one another.
Scroll up. Is there a picture of that? That shows one big cone in the event horizon, is that what you mean? With a bunch of
Right.
small cones on it?
Right, but what this shows is that the cone is your cone. Right? We each have our own time-space cone, light cone, because you're the center of the universe, your universe, because you're the perceiver, right? So you're the center of your universe, right? And in that sense, time proceeds individually, because each of us perceive time. So it's not like we have a collective sense of time. As human beings, we each have our own perspective of time, and your experience of time, you know, I would expect changes with your mood, right?
Activity level.
Yeah, if you're in a hurry, you know, you feel late, or you're retired and, you know, you're just twiddling your thumbs, wondering what you should do next, right? You know, all these books, which one should I read now? You know, right? You know, so in that sense, time changes as your perspective changes. There was a really interesting book by Alan Lightman called Einstein's Dreams. And he was here, by the way, one year, and I got to talk to him, which was cool. He gave the lecture at the freshman convocation at UAA. And I walked with him from the convocation over to the Cuddy Center when we had, where we had the greeting thing. But Einstein's Dreams, every chapter, time proceeds in a different way. And it's really head swirling, you know, as you try to grasp how he imagined each. So, by the way, the title doesn't have any bearing on Einstein. It wasn't Einstein having these dreams. This is Alan Lightman having these different dreams of time based on his thinking about Einstein's theory. So that's not where the title comes from. But that was so.
Have you read it?
Pardon?
Have you read it?
This? Yes.
Does it ever break outside of linear concepts of time?
Yes. At least a couple times. Very haphazard, of course,
I'm sure.
but it goes forwards, backwards, sideways. Very, very, very strange. Each chapter, it's like a different way that time would work. All except for the first chapter, of course, not being anything like what we experience. But it was interesting. And I did talk to him about it, so that was pretty cool. Yeah, I read it before I met him, which, whew,
Yeah.
you know, that's always useful. And so the second one is space. And this works the same way as time, although it's a little bit different. And that's because he points out that abstractions do not require space. So if we think about how we can be puzzled that, for example, the concept of love doesn't take up space, but Romeo and Juliet's balcony scene obviously requires a balcony and etc. Right? The abstract concepts do not take up space, but anything that has a dimensional characteristic has to take up space. But where does the space come from? It comes from us. And in his critique, he talks about an orange. I never have an orange when I need it, but you could, hold the cup or something else, and say, does this prove it? Does this prove his point? Focus on the cup. Now, when I move the cup, keep your focus on the space and not the cup. Right? So there. Right? The idea being that we're the ones that create the spatial relationships. It doesn't depend on the things themselves, but we give it its space, right? And then the same thing with all the other characteristics that Aristotle uses in his categories. So this becomes the a priori that structures our experience. For Hume, there isn't anything, and as a result, we can't know anything. With Kant, the answer is yes, human beings structure experience in a certain way. And this gives us categorical perceptions. And in fact, he's also famous for giving us a moral point of view that says, as a rational human being, in a particular moral situation where you have a moral dilemma, you know what the right thing to do is. It's your categorical imperative, right? So just as, for example, if I look and I see a piece of paper and I know it's a rectangle, right? I experience what might seem to be a moral dilemma, knowing the right answer. What ought to be done in that situation? What becomes a human problem is, and for Kant, he's not a consequentialist like the utilitarians. Remember, the utilitarians believe that you could do bad things if the overall goal was good, right? The greater good for the greater number, right? So we can sacrifice these individuals for the greater good. With Kant, being a pietist, his moral sense is that you can never use an individual as a means to an end, but you always have to treat each individual as valuable in themselves, right? So if you're in a situation where you have to sacrifice your life for someone, right? Your moral imperative says yes, you have to do that, but that's hard to do because you realize, well, that means I'm giving up my life. What about, my family and all that other? So I might have lots of reasons for not doing what my categorical imperative tells me I have to do. If I want to, I'll feel guilty. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I don't want to do it for my own reasons, right? So when we look at his moral judgments and so on, you're faced with this situation of knowing hopefully what you ought to do, but then having the problem of not necessarily wanting to do it because of the sacrifice that you have to make. So his moral categorical imperative. Let's see if this is a Wikipedia page. They're really pretty good. Categorical imperative. Categories of freedom. you can do a search, right? Control F. Categorical imperative. The categorical imperative. So if you're, yes, no? So if you're a rational person, you know what the right thing to do is. So usually when I bring this up, I'll ask a question as a quiz question. It's a two-part quiz question. And that is, you're driving home. It's late in the evening, it's already dark. You're in Detroit on the highway. It's a concrete highway with a barrier wall, and the traffic is stuck. No one is moving. 3 lanes, and you're just totally stuck. In the car next to you is a beautiful woman. Am I allowed to say that? That's okay, right? That's not harassment? Okay.
No.
Sorry. So in the car next to you is, and obviously I'm thinking as a male here, but obviously some of you are not males. But so you're in a car next to you, a beautiful person. There we go. It's a beautiful person in the car next to you. And you're all stuck sitting there, and for some reason these 3 ugly dudes in the car behind her, her, it's a her. This is actually a real story, right? You know, this really happened. But 3 ugly dudes, for some reason, are furious with her, and they get out of their car, and they start pounding on her car to get to her. And it looks like they're so angry that if they get to her, they're going to kill her. Right? So the first quiz question is, what is your moral imperative? Your categorical moral imperative. Should you interfere or not? But now I have a second part to that. And that is, what do you think you might actually do in such a situation? Nope, that's not it. Why do we have so many women jumping off of the bridge?
What bridge?
Yeah, which bridge in Detroit?
I usually when I type in Detroit woman, you know, jumping in the river, because she did hop out of the car and run for it, and they chased her. In fact, I think they were like beating her, and she jumped off the bridge into the river, but then she drowned in the river. And the thing, yeah, here we go. The crowd just watched.
Jeez. Wow.
In fact, worse, it looks like some of them cheered.
Oh my goodness.
How old is this? 95. Okay, that's about right.
Is 9.
They say 2 men went in the water after. Went into the water after, but were unable to rescue her.
stripped her underwear? Oh.
The thing that I'm thinking is, what did all these people think? What did they feel was their moral obligation? To laugh at the situation? I would think they all felt that they ought to do something, but no one did. You've heard of this sort of thing happening in other psychological studies, right? I know we had, years ago, we had a guy by the Penny's Mall, back in the day when people still went to the mall, you know, and, you know, the roommate was sitting on the guy with a kitchen knife, stabbing him. And people were just standing there looking in amazement. No one did anything, except for one guy that was driving by, stopped, got out of his car, had a shotgun, told the guy to stop, or he would shoot, and the guy wouldn't stop, so he shot him 2 or 3 times before the guy, with a shotgun.
Wow.
Is this
Impressive.
the 80s? Just. Is this the 80s or when was this?
It was in the 80s, I think. And you know what?
80s and 80s and Anchorage. Yep.
You remember it?
Absolutely. I definitely remember the 80s. I was. Yeah, still an still an egg. It was great.
60s were great too. They were moving and shaking, I hear, especially on 64.
68?
64.
64.
What happened in '68?
Is that Kennedy? No, when?
It was 63.
63.
63.
I was born in 64.
I used to have a mind.
Good year. I
I could remember stuff. Now it's like, Lord help me, 1776, that's a good date. I remember that one. No, the thing that's amazing is, you know, of course, all the people standing around and didn't do anything except for the one guy with the shotgun. And the police arrested the guy with the shotgun.
Yeah, they'd have to.
You're not allowed to fire a shotgun in the city, you know,
Yeah.
but
Endangerment to others.
Mm-hmm.
You might not go to prison
Great
for
decade
it,
of rock
but they
and
still
roll.
have to arrest.
they threw it out. They threw it
Yeah.
out. As everybody went, you know how we do.
I wonder if it's changed much. 'cause
We
we
all-
had that fire.
We all
recently.
gathered in the Capitol building and, you know, said, we want in. No, that was yesterday.
Oh,
Yesterday? 2 days ago.
Pocket in the secret chambers. So is it possible in that bridge scene that, I mean, just a theory, it's at night, there's so many people around, and this bizarre scene is occurring, that somehow, some way, these people standing around are thinking these people are related or friends. I mean, there's violence going on, but it's such a bizarre scene that people are kind of waiting for things to act out and maybe stop because it's just too bizarre to be in front of so many people that, I don't know,
yeah.
it's just,
That's a possibility, or the other thing is they now teach you as part of like first aid or anything above that, is when you designate somebody to call 911. It's not, you're sitting there pumping on his chest doing CPR, you're not saying call 911, you're literally, you call 911. Because if you just say somebody call 911, everyone
No.
else goes, someone else in here's gonna do it, and
or
nobody does
everybody
it.
calls and jams up the line.
Yeah.
Right.
Isn't that called like the bystander
Bystander
effect? That like, oh,
Mhm.
I don't
Somebody
need
has
to do it. Someone else is gonna do it. I don't need to.
Or the fact that there's 3 men, what am I gonna do to stop 3 men?
Yeah.
You know, even if you're a male, you're thinking, these guys are crazy. If I intervene, I'm going down too, and I might be able to subdue one, but what the heck's going on here?
You
And
need
back
the
then, if
shotgun.
it's in the 80s, you don't have all the luxuries that we have today.
Well,
You know,
you're
I mean, you
not
don't
gonna
have
call.
cell phones.
Yeah.
people don't have cell phones. Even if you did, the traffic was absolutely
No.
blocked.
Yeah, and I've been on that bridge. The neighborhood that's associated with it, I'm not knocking on anybody's door out there to see if I can borrow a cell phone or borrow a house phone at that point.
Or carry with me.
I'm curious what the difference is between phenomena that are dangerous and life-threatening that aren't caused or aren't being actively caused by a person versus those that are. Because even this is a little bit different being 3 guys versus the other one, which is like, you know, she's in her car still, maybe they're gonna break through soon, there's that like, what's gonna happen, versus the guy who's got her outside stripping down, holding her crowbar. A little bit different of a scenario in my mind, versus like a month ago when we had a fire on the side of the road, and there were like 12 of us that stopped and got out and stomped out that fire until the firefighters showed up. No one's hesitated to jump in the middle of a fire. Probably not a smart thing, but we did stop it from getting into the woods until the firefighters arrived. So I wonder if there's a psychological difference between combat against people, combat against nature. I'm just curious, like obviously I don't have the answer to that.
And I think the other part is cultural.
Here
Here
and now.
versus, well, here and now versus just Anchorage, as much as it's a big city, it's a small town versus.
Mentality, yeah.
Everyone looks at me weird when I go into Chicago because I'm like, hi, hello. 'Cause I've been raised up here and that's all you do going down, downtown Anchorage. And everyone's like, I don't talk to you, I don't,
Right.
I politely
Culture.
pretend that you don't exist and you pretend I don't exist.
Mhm.
And so how much of that is,
Big city.
big city?
Well, even in Anchorage, compared to like the villages, there's a big difference.
Yeah.
I remember reading Seth Kantner's book, Ordinary Wolves, which Seth Kantner was raised by his parents out in the bush outside of Nome.
Raised by wolves.
No, but
Oh,
but
okay.
he got to see a lot of wolves. But Seth Kantner, he's a regular writer now, has been for a long time.
Why the title?
One of his characters in the book, real person, was a elder, a native elder, who was a hunter, and that he knew this character, and he's basically describing the character and the change in the nature of hunting over that character's lifetime, from when he was a young man and he learned how to hunt with his dogs, to the point of, where the story is, where the young men in the village go out on their snow machines with automatic rifles and just blast the heck out of everything. So the nature of the environment has changed drastically, basically been wiped out. So it's kind of sad. But the point I was going to make is when Seth comes into Anchorage for the first time, he's never been in such a big city. He lands at the airport, and he's wearing the leather homemade mucklucks
The boots.
that was made for him, and it turns out to be warm and wet, and so it's ruining his boots. But he's walking from the airport, and he's looking for a particular person whose name is January. That's his name, right? And everyone in the village knew January. He was the pilot that would fly in from Anchorage, and so he was looking for January in Anchorage. He's walking down the street from the airport, and he sees someone, and he says, "I'm looking for January." And of course, everybody looks at him like he's a crazy homeless dude. January, that's a month. How do you look for a month, right? Plus, you can't just fly into Anchorage, walk down from the airport, and ask where someone is, right? That's not the kind of town this is, right?
That's what Facebook is for.
This was before Facebook, but he's walking, further, and he notices that there are numbers on the houses. And so he says, someone took the time to count and put numbers on all these houses. It was absolutely crazy. But what he also discovered is that when he would be walking along and he'd see somebody, that they apparently had trouble with their eyes because they didn't see him. By the way, it's also hilarious when he was walking in the airport and women are in high heels. You've never seen that before. But yeah, it's so when you think about culture and experience, and you think about how we behave, even walking by someone, it's totally amazing how big a difference is when you visit small villages and you want to talk to people. Yeah, we talk to people. Just the other day I was sitting, in a waiting room, and a kid came in wearing a St. Patty's Day shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in months, right? That's the wrong month. It's the wrong month for St. Patty's Day, and he came in and he sat down, and I said something about it. I knew two people that their birthdays were on St. Patty's Day, but somehow I ended up quoting Hagrid. And that started him off. He started telling us all sorts of things about Harry Potter, most of which I already knew, of course, but nonetheless, I had turned him on, and he just started talking and talking and talking about all these things in Harry Potter. And we could do that in Anchorage, talk to people. Although, would you say there's a big difference between being a male and just talking to some stranger, and being female and talking to a stranger?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, depends on which stranger I end up talking to. Yeah.
My wife says to me that, because we'll be together, and I'll say hi to some person, and
Mm-hmm.
talk to them, or people talk to us, and I'll just talk to them, and she feels like she can't do that, because that would seem forward for a woman to do that, but I can get away with it because I'm a dumb guy. Just
Some people take it wrong.
Just
Just a
make fun,
woman
that's
saying
crazy.
it sometimes.
But so do we have, I think we would all agree, we've had enough experience with the modern social science, really, to know that, of course, these kinds of things are cultural and place-related. I remember, what's the author that wrote Reviving Ophelia? What was her name? Shoot, what's her name? Mary Pfeiffer? Pfeiffer. She was here, gave a lecture, and in the lecture she talked about going for a walk that day on the Tony Knowles Trail, and how people would just talk to her. And she thought that was amazing. She was from New York or someplace, and it was just unheard of that strangers would just talk to you out of, and it was not because they recognized her, but still hilarious. Oh well. So, question one, in that situation, what do you think your moral categorical imperative would be? And the second part of that same question, what do you think you might actually do? And by the way, of course, I'm not saying that there is a correct moral imperative today. But Kant would have expected that be the case, in the same way that I would have known that blanket is a rectangle. So that's the way Kant was. But yes, he was pretty isolated in a particular town where everyone pretty much thought in a very specific, very rigorous sort of way. And as you saw in that movie, which I think accurately portrays some of his characteristics, he and
They put beer there too, so they probably kept from there too, right?
there was beer there.
Tony'sburg? I'm just joking.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure he would have drunk beer, although I don't think he ever got drunk.
Actually,
there are-
the person in town if you got a brewery, right?
I can't imagine, I
Because
mean,
they're allergic to gluten, it's possible.
Cons have them.
So are you saying like, based on the quiz question, the way we answer it, it's based like at a certain time when you don't have certain things, or just in general? Like if, you know, like,
Well,
you have
it'd
to
be-
pretend there's
it would be
scenarios where you
particular
don't have
to-
a phone, or you don't have that kind of stuff, or it doesn't matter?
you can answer it however you like, for sure. A lot of people have
Was it
said
based in a time when there was, what year was this?
that they didn't have cell phones at the time.
Okay.
A lot of people say that what they would do is, I found it interesting that more males would say that they would get out of the car and try to do something. Not sure what, but females normally would say they would get on their cell phone and call. And that's interesting because when Kant's talking about a rational person, he's thinking as a male, I'm sure, and so, you know, would it be different for a female? Well, it would actually be different for everybody, you know. What if you had family at home and stuff, you know, because if you get out of the car, that could be bad, depending on what happens, right?
So categorical, that concept, isn't it supposed to like lead into like universalization? So like, I would universally like if I'm being attacked on a bridge that someone would do something. You know, it's not that someone would get out of the car or call 911, it just do something. And so then that something can be then, you know, divided as to what you would end up doing, but you universalize the idea that if someone was in danger, you had the moral imperative or the categorical imperative to do something.
To help.
Here's the maxim, the formulation for it. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
So it is universalization, is you would do something
From
that,
Kant's point of view, right, he's feeling like, there was a quote on the APU hall building, the very first one, which is that the Cars building? As you go up the hill into APU, but it used to have like a kind of bunch of stars, it was blue, and then there was a quote from Kant that was, the two things that amazed me are the heavens, you know, above and the moral law within. Did I quote that right? Let me check. Kant. Starry heaven above, and moral law within. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Remember, he spoke German, so that's a translation. But they had that quote on the building, and for some reason, a few years ago, they took it off. And I thought, are they fixing that up and then putting it back? They never put it back. So, what?
They must have given up on it.
It's kind of sad.
It is sad. I don't know, I think a lot of people don't help people even when they see stuff going wrong.
Well, Tim's question about, like, you know,
Well, right, like the fire. I
the
know.
social.
I lived in
Yeah.
Salt Lake City and I was attacked when I was 18 years old on a college campus. And men and women walked past while I was being beat up by a guy and not one person did anything. So, that's something to think about.
In Salt Lake City too, that's interesting,
With all the Mormons.
right?
Not one person stopped to help.
There's more studies that are starting to show evidence for a sense of numbness towards violence in the current generations. The young, more so in the youngers because of all the exposure to what they're seeing visually through whatever means they are. Whether it's social media, stories, whether it's news, whether it's movies, whether it's video gaming, whatever that is, the visual stimulus of violence that's repeatedly being shown for, obviously, profit reasons, clickbait reasons. It is starting to show clinical evidence of a sense of numbness in the society towards violence, to the extent that it's longing for more violence of a greater extent to be stimulated, if that makes sense. You need to see more gore. In fact, some of the things that I used to sense as absolute nasty gore when I was young, that kind of stuff today, for kids, they laugh at it. It's amusing to them. In the horror movies, you hear kids in these theaters laughing at this stuff. Wow, that's awesome. You know, the more recent movie, what was it? It's Joker.
Oh, yeah.
The initial showing of that, they had a fright scare at that showing, and people had actually left the theater because of fear of the arousal of people from a standpoint of doing crazy things in that movie, of laughing, shouting, yay, as this guy, whoever the character was, just absolutely violently killing people. So it's that
So
kind of
I'm not gonna
concept
watch
that's
that movie.
occurring. It's that kind of thing that's occurring to where it will not be uncommon that you see people stand by idly to just observe it because they're used to observing it. And they're not in a mode mindset. And it may be unintentional. They just have not been programmed culturally to respond appropriately out of moral obligation. But they're just used to being kind of indoctrinated to the concept of viewing it and becoming numb to it. It's kind of sad from my perspective. I mean, I've been in combat, so I know what it's like to be exposed to violence of that nature. So like, to answer the question of nature versus people, I would premise that nature doesn't necessarily fight back at you. It can be violent, it can be unpredictable, but it's a little bit more predictable than people when it comes to violence and when it comes to danger. A forest fire, you can expose yourself to danger to try to help put it out, to the extent to where you think, you know what, I need to kind of bail out on this because I sense this thing's getting too overwhelming. It may be so much that you do so much that you become overwhelmed, which our firefighters have had. But in combat, you got stuff going on that you don't always have a situational awareness that you can control, and things just happen, you know.
So the unpredictability of, like, if I get into it with these three guys who are beating on this car, I may not be able to get out of this solution scenario. Well, that's valuable as a psychological.
It's all based on what you think your capabilities are. If I had a bat in the car, wow, I could probably subdue two of the people. The third one might take the bat from me and I might be in trouble. You just have to weigh these things of what your capabilities are, you know? Person who's got, you know, self-defense capabilities and multiple things, you know, and they could go in there and whoop up all three of them in a heartbeat, you know? Who knows? If you're one guy, you might think, I'll go whoop up on them, but I need 4 other guys with me. So I'm gonna stay tight. So, yeah, that's just my 2 cents, sorry.
Oh, that's great.
great.
That's great.
That was great.
It's fascinating because it adds to what you were talking about earlier with the psychological predisposition of the not observer, what was it you said, Aggie, you said? It wasn't the observer effect, was it? It was
It's
something-
the bystander.
Bystander.
So that's one psychological effect, and we just named off one that's newly becoming labeled, which is the same result, but instead of just being like, oh my god, look what's happening, they're like, oh my god, look what's happening. So different disposition, same result, no one gives aid. And so if you just stack up a list of different dispositions, I would think that you would just see the quantity of unfortunate results also increase.
Have you ever been around someone and you do something with them that's kind of tragic or kind of scary, and they're like, whoa, dude, play that back?
No.
I have.
Oh, like on a video, you mean?
Yeah, could
That
be
would be the
video.
last time to see.
Oh, oh, yeah.
Wow, you see,
The,
play that
the,
back.
the ball player running to catch something and smacking into the wall, do it again,
Did
Ooh,
you,
look how
Okay,
his
but
head
it's a
hits the
padded
wall.
And he didn't break his arm, but his arm went like,
Um,
whoa.
Some of those
So-
programs that
oh,
have
you
funniest
forgot.
bloopers and blunders, a lot of those actual events that we laugh at, they're actually injuries. Some serious.
Well, there is a suspension of disbelief in some movies, fortunately.
Right.
So when the lawyer in Jurassic Park, is sitting on the John and the
Oh, yeah.
and the I think a lot of people cheer for that, but that's
Yeah.
because he's a lawyer.
And I wonder, you get some people who like go into horror movies and you're looking for, the cheesy horror movie. Yes, it's bloody and gory, but you're seeing the boom mic still because it's just low production value.
Right.
And so like I think like some of those movies going into it, like all of the actors still live at the end of it, so whether or not the characters still do, and so you have that sort of suspension of belief that, oh, okay, this is fine, we can laugh at this because and the other is sometimes you don't know what else to do, and so you end up watching people in serious situations that they don't know what else to do, and so start to giggle. That's
Mickey, what did you have?
did you hear about that story with the senior center that got turned into a fight club?
Yeah,
what?
yeah, some
Yeah.
young ladies turned the senior center, assisted living center into a fight club.
Yeah, and yeah, the older they are, the more money. So they created this secret web page that people would go and bid to see these senior citizens in the senior center fight. And I was like, why would they fight? But I guess they had, in order to get their food or medicine, they had to fight. So the owner of this place was making like millions of dollars by getting money from people bidding. And in my mind, I'm like, why would the first person who saw this not do anything? How did it get so far to where they made so much money? Like you said, like, why did it take so long for somebody to finally do something and report them? Because I'm like, obviously,
Was it that way?
something is wrong about this. I mean, we see grandpa fighting,
It's terrible.
Yeah, willingly, but yeah. Yeah, it was in the news or something. They finally got, I don't know how they finally got caught, but yeah.
And they did finally pass a law. I don't know if Trump signed it yet, but they did pass a law about animal abuse, which strikes me as kind of, wow, I thought all along that we had something like that. Guess not. But I remember as a kid, guys would all say, fight, 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 if there was, there was a spot on the one path going up to the high school where at least 2 or 3 fights a year or something would happen, and there was always a crowd around.
Work in a middle school.
Yeah.
That mentality is alive
Same
and
thing with
well.
chicken fights.
That was what we called relational development back then. All those intense moments of fellowship.
It seems like something violent though is always coming up. Like even if it's like my mom who lives in New York. Remember when the knockout punch thing
Yeah.
was going around?
Mm-hmm.
My mom was one of those. She was in a subway station and somebody punched her, kind of thing. I mean, it seems like something. It's like almost people crave for some kind of violent, and it's almost they crave for attention and they don't know how to get it, so then they resort to violence, and it's just. I mean, I don't know. It seems like we're our own destruction. It's just horrible.
We were in D.C. with a group of students once, and we were walking, going from the one train to the other. So we were like in like the subway station, and as we were all walking, the students were in front of me and my wife, and behind Jim Mueller. And as we were walking, someone just popped one of the students in the back of the head with something. It just happened that quickly, and
then they take off and
they took off,
they,
and
yeah,
yeah,
it happened so quick, and
she was all right.
yeah,
That was, but startled.
yeah.
But despite the sound of it, I don't know what he hit her with, but she was okay. But still,
It's just horrible.
you get a sudden you know, you can actually feel the adrenaline squirting, you know, it's kind of,
Time slows.
Yeah.
zzz, and you're like, ah, and it's over, and you know, now what do you do with it?
Come down off of the adrenaline.
And realize you're in pain. Yeah.
I mean, you'd say to the cop, you know, what happened, and he was like, you know, nothing he could do, et cetera.
Yeah. It happens so fast sometimes you don't even get the.
Yeah. Ah. Okay, so, talking about Hume, mentioned Kant, and so, and the last reading that we had is another female, MacDonald, that kind of gives us our a little bit more contemporary point of view. That's kind of amazing because she was a student of Wittgenstein. And in fact, she, so Margaret MacDonald, she was born 1907. I forgot to give you guys a break. Should we take a break? We should take a
What was
break.
the second question? That was a two-part question.
That was a two-part question. The second one was, what would you actually do? Can you imagine? So the first is, what do you think your categorical imperative?
So you were only gonna do a two-part question. You weren't gonna have a second question, separate from the.
That was a two-part first quiz question. We still have to do one more.
Oh, okay.
quiz
So there will
question.
be 3 questions to answer. Got it.
Sorry about that.
Maths. Okay.
I just have to do both of those for the one question.
But if you exist in past, present, and future, then it'll be 9 questions.
But only one answer.
Yeah. Which could be